Donald Trump just launched a global organization where $1 billion buys you a permanent seat at the table. France said no. Germany walked away. New Zealand shut the door. But Russia's ready to pay with frozen sanctions money. What exactly is Trump selling, and why are America's oldest allies refusing to buy? New Zealand just became the latest Western democracy to walk away from something Donald Trump is calling the Board of Peace. They're not alone. France turned it down, so did Germany. The United Kingdom passed, Italy declined, and the list keeps growing. This isn't hesitation. It's not a scheduling conflict or diplomatic red tape. It's a coordinated rejection. And it's coming from the countries that have traditionally formed the backbone of American-led global order. Meanwhile, around 35 nations have said yes. But here's the thing. Most of them aren't democracies. They're authoritarian states, semi-authoritarian regimes, or countries with highly centralized power structures that operate very differently from the West. So what's really happening here? Why are Trump's traditional allies turning their backs on what's being framed as a peacekeeping initiative? And why are the governments signing up the ones that operate outside the rules-based system America itself helped build? The answer lies not in what the Board of Peace claims to do, but in what it actually is. Trump introduced the Board of Peace on January 22nd at the World Economic Forum in Davos. It was a high-profile moment, broadcast globally, and positioned as a response to the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. He tied it to a United Nations Security Council resolution passed in November 2025 that called for international assistance in rebuilding Gaza following months of devastating conflict. On the surface, it sounded reasonable, even necessary. But then the founding charter was released, and Gaza, it's not mentioned, not once. Instead, the document outlines an organization with the authority to promote stability, restore governance, and ensure long-term peace, not just in Gaza, but in conflict zones anywhere on the planet. There are no geographic limits, no defined scope, no sunset clause. This isn't an aid initiative. It's a global governance mechanism. And the structure? That's where things get truly unusual. Trump names himself as the permanent chair. He can only be removed through a unanimous vote by an executive body. An executive body he controls the composition of. Countries that contribute more than $1 billion receive permanent seats. Everyone else gets short-term membership that can be renewed, extended, or revoked entirely at Trump's discretion. He decides who stays. He decides who goes. He decides what the organization does next. There is no independent oversight, no checks from elected bodies, no accountability to international law beyond vague references to UN ideals that the board itself ignores in practice. This is not how multilateral institutions work. This is how private clubs work. New Zealand's Prime Minister, Christopher Luxon, didn't mince words. He called the proposal unacceptable in its current form and made it clear his government wouldn't be participating. Foreign Minister Winston Peters went further. He pointed out that the Board of Peace overlaps with existing United Nations frameworks that already have legitimacy, transparency, and accountability built in. He also noted that regional actors were already engaged in Gaza reconstruction efforts, and that adding New Zealand to Trump's board would contribute little beyond symbolic endorsement. Translation: We're not interested in lending credibility to something that doesn't deserve it. France was even more direct. French officials rejected the initiative outright, stating that it far exceeds any Gaza-related mandate and fundamentally challenges the principles that underpin the United Nations system. Italy's Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, a right-leaning leader often seen as friendly to Trump, said participation would conflict with the Italian constitution. That's not a polite deflection. That's a legal barrier. Slovenia's Prime Minister, Robert Golob, went a step further, warning that the Board of Peace represents a serious threat to the existing international order. These aren't fringe voices. These are the leaders of established democracies with legal systems, constitutional protections, and institutions that limit executive power, even their own. And they're all saying the same thing. This doesn't fit within the rules-based system we've spent decades building and defending. To understand why democratic governments are walking away, you have to look at what the Board of Peace actually represents, not as rhetoric, but as structure. This is legitimacy arbitrage. The board borrows credibility from the United Nations by referencing Security Council resolutions and invoking the language of international cooperation. But it operates completely outside UN oversight, accountability, or legal authority. It's like opening a private investment fund and calling it the Federal Reserve because it deals with money. The name suggests institutional backing. The reality is entirely different. Financially, this is a pay-to-access model. $1 billion buys permanent influence. Less than that? You're a temporary member whose seat can vanish at any moment. This isn't transparent development funding tied to reconstruction projects with measurable outcomes. It's a membership fee for ongoing political access to the sitting U.S. president. And well, the list of countries that have signed up tells you everything you need to know about who finds that arrangement attractive. Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, Indonesia, Argentina, Albania, Hungary, Pakistan. These are not random choices. These are countries with either direct regional interests in the conflicts Trump might mediate, or political systems that favor personalized power, bilateral deals, and transactional diplomacy over rules-based multilateralism. Some are outright authoritarian. Others are hybrid regimes where democratic institutions exist on paper, but operate under heavy executive control in practice. And then there's Russia. Vladimir Putin made an offer that exposes the entire logic of this system. He proposed using Russian state assets frozen by the United States as sanctions for the invasion of Ukraine, to cover Russia's billion-dollar contribution to the Board of Peace. Let that sink in for a moment. Sanctions are punitive measures. They're designed to impose costs on governments that violate international law. They're supposed to deter aggression, limit resources for war, and signal global disapproval. Putin wants to convert those sanctions into a ticket for permanent access to Trump's authority. In practical terms, this would turn a penalty for invading a sovereign nation into a reward. A guaranteed seat at a table where peace, governance, and conflict resolution are supposedly decided. That's not diplomacy. That's a transaction. And it reveals exactly what the Board of Peace is designed to do: exchange money and political alignment for proximity to American executive power, regardless of legality, morality, or institutional norms. There's another detail that often gets overlooked, but it's critical. Canada was initially expected to participate. Then at Davos, Prime Minister Mark Carney gave a speech about the need for middle power countries, nations like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and several European states, to cooperate independently and chart a path that isn't dictated by major powers. Shortly after, Canada's invitation to the Board of Peace was pulled. The timing wasn't coincidental. The Board of Peace appears specifically designed to prevent exactly this kind of independent coalition building among mid-sized democracies. It centralizes influence around Trump personally and makes participation conditional on financial loyalty and political alignment. Middle powers that want to preserve their independence, maintain constitutional limits on executive authority, and operate within multilateral rules have no reason to join, and every reason to stay out. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres issued a statement that, while diplomatically phrased, was absolutely clear in its meaning. He reminded the international community that responsibility for global peace and security rests solely with the UN Security Council. Only the Security Council has the legal authority to issue binding decisions on all member states. No alternative body, no matter who creates it, can enforce compliance in matters of war and peace. That statement is a direct challenge to the Board of Peace's expanded mandate. Guterres didn't need to mention Trump by name. The message was unmistakable. You cannot simply create a parallel system and claim the same authority as the United Nations. That's not how international law works. And this matters because the UN system, for all its flaws, was built on a fundamental principle. No single country, no matter how powerful, should be able to unilaterally determine the rules for everyone else. The Board of Peace flips that principle on its head. There's a historical parallel worth noting. In 2003, when George W. Bush sought international support for the invasion of Iraq, Europe fractured. The United Kingdom, Spain, Poland, and Hungary sided with Washington. France and Germany refused. The transatlantic alliance was deeply damaged. Trust eroded. Cooperation became conditional. The rift took years to repair, and in some ways it never fully healed. The Board of Peace is producing a similar divide today. But this time, the split is even sharper. Back then, the question was whether to support a specific military intervention. Today, the question is whether to accept a fundamental restructuring of how global governance works, away from multilateral institutions and toward personalized, transactional authority. And the democracies are saying no. So, where does this go from here? Well, three scenarios seem increasingly likely. First, within the next 6 months, the Board of Peace will lose practical relevance in Gaza reconstruction. The countries with real reconstruction capacity, European democracies, Japan, major multilateral development banks, they're staying out. The countries that have joined either lack the technical expertise to rebuild Gaza, or they have competing regional agendas that will just paralyze decision-making. Without European money, engineering knowledge, and institutional experience, the board simply cannot deliver on its stated purpose. Second, Trump will likely pivot the board's focus toward conflicts where he can claim diplomatic wins without needing allied support. Ukraine is the obvious candidate. Russia's interest in joining is tied directly to the possibility that the board could legitimize territorial outcomes favorable to Moscow, while bypassing UN restrictions and European objections. If Ukraine negotiations are moved into this forum, it would institutionalize the growing divide between the United States and Europe over the future of continental security. Third, continued refusals will push middle-power democracies to deepen alternative forms of cooperation. Mark Carney's Davos speech laid out that vision clearly. Flexible coalitions built around rules, legitimacy, and shared norms rather than transactional access to dominant powers. New Zealand's rejection, citing alignment with the UN Charter, reflects exactly this approach. Coordination rooted in law and institutions rather than executive-level bargaining. In other words, the Board of Peace may end up accelerating the very thing it was designed to prevent: independent cooperation among democracies that no longer see American leadership as reliable or rules-based. What we're witnessing is a fundamental test of how global power operates. For decades, American influence has rested on multilateral institutions, treaty alliances, and shared norms. Washington didn't always get its way, but it operated within systems that gave smaller countries a voice and ensured that power was checked, balanced, and accountable. The Board of Peace rejects that model entirely. It transforms U.S. geopolitical leverage into a direct, monetized asset. Pay $1 billion. Gain permanent access, refuse to pay, lose your seat. It's governance as a subscription service. And the countries walking away are doing so because they understand something crucial. Institutions matter more than individuals. They know that personalized authority, no matter how powerful in the short term, is unreliable over time. Leaders change, priorities shift, deals get renegotiated or abandoned. But institutions, when they're transparent, accountable, and rules-based, endure. France, Germany, the UK, New Zealand, and others are betting that the UN-centered order, flawed as it is, offers more long-term stability than a billion-dollar club controlled by one person. The Board of Peace is being framed as a solution to global conflict, but in reality, it's a marker, a dividing line that separates countries willing to preserve institutional legitimacy from those willing to trade it for access to American power. The democracies are choosing institutions. The autocracies are choosing access. And the question we're left with is this: if America's closest allies no longer trust its leadership enough to participate in its initiatives, what does that say about the future of American influence itself? Because power without legitimacy is just force. And force, as history has shown us again and again, doesn't last. The Board of Peace isn't just about Gaza. It's not even just about Trump. It's about whether the rules-based international system, messy, frustrating, imperfect as it is, still matters in a world where money and personal loyalty are being offered as replacements. The countries saying no aren't rejecting peace. They're rejecting the price tag. If this story made you think, hit that like button and subscribe, because this is only the beginning. I'll see you in the next one.